To save his dying son, the quiet translator Elias Vance made a desperate plea to ruthless CEO Marcus Thorne, only to be met with cold, humiliating mockery. But when Thorne unknowingly handed over his family's history for a simple translation project, he also handed over the weapon of his own ruin. Hidden within a dusty, leather-bound ledger was a secret written in a forgotten dialect, the truth of a crime upon which Thorne's entire empire was built. The world saw a powerless father begging a king for a cure, but it would soon witness a scholar meticulously preparing to dismantle that kingdom. This was not a battle of wealth, but of words, and Elias was a master of his craft.
This is TS Simple Serene Stories. Before we get back to this touching story, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that humanity and miracles are eternal, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get back to the story.
The only sound in the apartment, other than the quiet hum of the refrigerator, was the rhythmic puffing of the nebulizer from the other room. It was a sound Elias Vance no longer consciously registered, as integral to the silence as his own breathing. It was the sound of his son, Leo, sleeping. At his desk, buried in the warm glow of a single lamp, Elias stared at a passage of dense 18th century text, its spidery script a puzzle he was slowly unlocking. On his laptop screen, the archaic German morphed into clean, precise English, whereupon the guildmaster declared the alloy's properties a matter of divine providence, rather than metallurgical science. He was a man who lived between worlds, between languages, between the quiet past and a terrifyingly uncertain future. His small apartment was a testament to this. Books stacked in precarious towers on every available surface, their spines a mosaic of tongues, living and dead. Taped to the walls, interspersed between bookshelves, were Leo's drawings, vibrant crayon and marker fantasies of rocket ships blasting through swirling nebulas and deep-sea submersibles discovering cities of coral, worlds without atmospheric pressure, worlds without the need for oxygen tanks. A small, dry cough echoed from the bedroom. Elias rose without a thought, his chair scraping softly against the worn wooden floor. He pushed open Leo's door to find his 7-year-old son sitting up in bed, the plastic mask of the nebulizer dangling from his hand. "Is it tomorrow yet, Papa?" Leo asked, his voice raspy. "Almost, buddy. Go back to sleep." Elias gently took the mask, fitting it back over Leo's small nose and mouth. He adjusted the worn teddy bear at his side and smoothed the blanket. "Were you reading the secret codes again?" Leo's eyes, large and startlingly perceptive, studied his father's face. He saw the weariness there that Elias tried so hard to hide. Elias managed a smile. "Something like that. It's for a job, a potential one." "To get the money?" The question was so direct, so devoid of artifice, that it struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. "To get the money," he confirmed, his voice softer than he intended. "Now sleep. Dream of Saturn's rings." He returned to his desk, the weight of that simple question settling on his shoulders. For 6 months, his life had been a two-pronged attack. By day, he was a father, managing medications, doctor's appointments, and breathing treatments. By night, he was a hunter. He wasn't just taking any freelance translation job that came his way. He was pursuing a very specific prey. His research had shown him that a disproportionate number of the world's leading pharmaceutical and medical research firms had their roots in Switzerland. And so, he had methodically cultivated a niche, almost useless to anyone else, a mastery of archaic Swiss-German dialects. He had spent hundreds of hours poring over historical documents, corporate charters, and personal letters, building a linguistic arsenal for a war he wasn't sure he could win. He wasn't waiting for a miracle. He was trying to build one, word by painstaking word. The breakthrough, or what felt like one, came not from a historical text, but from the cold blue light of his laptop screen at 2 a.m. It was a press release from OmniGen, a titan of the tech and pharmaceutical industries. The headline was bold. OmniGen announces Genesis trial, a new frontier in gene therapy. Elias devoured the article. The science was dense, a thicket of terminology about viral vectors and protein synthesis. But the conclusion was a beacon in the dark. The experimental therapy was showing unprecedented success in halting the progression of rare degenerative lung diseases, including the specific variant that was slowly, inexorably stealing his son's future. For a dizzying moment, hope, fierce and painful, seized him. It was a physical sensation, a tightening in his chest that felt terrifyingly like joy. Then came the wall. He found the official page for the trial. The cost of entry was listed, a string of numbers so long it seemed abstract, closer to a nation's GDP than a medical bill. It was a cure reserved for the global elite, a life raft with a price tag of a private island. Undeterred, he spent the next hour crafting a careful professional email, attaching Leo's medical files and a summary of his case. The reply came in less than 5 minutes, an automated corporate-branded rejection, thanking him for his interest and wishing him well. Despair began to creep in, cold and familiar. He was about to close the browser when his methodical training took over. He went back to his own database, the one listing every Swiss heritage medical company. He typed in OmniGen, and there it was, a new job posting listed just 2 days prior. Seeking specialist translator for historical document archival. Project OmniGen Corporate Heritage Museum. Requirements: fluency in 18th and 19th century Swiss-German dialects. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the target. The months of thankless obsessive study had led him directly to this. It wasn't a back door. It was a key he had forged himself. He wasn't going to beg for a handout. He was going to get into the room with the man at the top and make his case. Not as a charity case, but as a peer whose skills the company required. The OmniGen tower was a spear of smoked glass and black steel that pierced the sky, a monument to a power so vast it felt elemental. Standing in the lobby, Elias, in his best and only suit, felt like a ghost haunting a world he didn't belong to. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and money. He was led to the top floor, to the office of the CEO, Marcus Thorne. The room was an exercise in calculated intimidation. A single massive desk of polished obsidian sat before a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god's-eye view of the city below. There was no art on the walls, no personal photographs, nothing to suggest the occupant was a man. It was the lair of an idea, the idea of absolute control. Marcus Thorne matched his surroundings. He was sharp, impeccably dressed, and radiated an aura of impatient, predatory energy. He listened with a bored expression as his assistant introduced Elias and the museum project. "He comes highly recommended," the assistant finished. One of only a handful of experts in the world in this specific dialect. Thorne gave Elias a dismissive glance. "The language of dead merchants, fitting for a museum. Fine." This was his moment. Elias took a steadying breath. "Mr. Thorne, my expertise is at your disposal. But I am here for another reason." He stepped forward, placing a slim file on the edge of the vast desk. "This is my son's medical record." Thorne didn't look at it. A flicker of something Annoyance, perhaps contempt, crossed his face. Elias pressed on, his voice even and measured. He spoke of Leo, of the Genesis trial, of appealing not to his charity, but to his sense of legacy. The work I would do for your museum is about preserving the past. This is about building a future. For one small boy, yes, but also for the story your company tells the world. When he finished, silence filled the cavernous office. Thorne leaned back in his chair, a slow, cruel smirk spreading across his lips. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a low purr. "Sentiment is a liability. Hope is the luxury of those who can afford the disappointment. You walk in here, into the heart of an empire built on ruthless efficiency and the cold, hard math of progress, and you try to barter with a sad story?" He gestured vaguely at the file on his desk. "Every day I receive 100 stories like that. 1,000. They are statistical noise. My company is not a charity, and I am not a priest. We are in the business of victory, not consolation." He stood, the audience clearly over. "Give your details to my assistant for the translation project. If your work is satisfactory, you will be paid. That is the only transaction we will be having." With a final dismissive wave, he turned to look out at his kingdom of glass and steel, leaving Elias standing in the center of the room, utterly alone. The humiliation was a physical thing, a burning heat on his face. He had played his hand, his one calculated strategic card, and the king hadn't even bothered to look at it before sweeping it from the table. For 2 days, the silence in the apartment was different. The rhythmic puff of the nebulizer remained, but it was now underscored by the dead weight of Elias's failure. The humiliation he'd felt in Thorne's office had cooled into a familiar, gnawing despair. He'd look at Leo, so full of life and imagination, and feel the walls of his son's future closing in. But despair was a luxury, and the final notice from the utility company tucked under a magnet on the refrigerator was a stark reminder of that. He needed the money. He needed Thorne's money. With a sense of profound self-loathing, he called Thorne's assistant and accepted the translation job. A few days later, 4 large archive-grade boxes arrived. They smelled of dust and old paper, the scent of forgotten history. For the first week, the work was as soulless as he'd imagined. He sat under his lamp, translating mundane business charters, supply orders for chemicals with long-forgotten names, and letters of incorporation. It was the sterile official story of OmniGen's founding, a narrative of shrewd investments and relentless progress, all written in a precise, formal dialect. He worked methodically, his mind a machine, turning the archaic words into clean English, depositing the payments and paying the bills. It was during the second week that he noticed it. One of the items was a large, handsome business ledger, bound in dark green leather. It was heavy, its pages filled with the neat columns of Alistair Finch's early transactions. But as Elias handled it, he felt an odd imbalance. The binding was unusually thick on one side, the leather cover slightly more pliable than it should have been. His translator's curiosity, the part of him that was always looking for the hidden meaning, the subtext, was piqued. That night, after Leo was asleep, he took a small, flexible palette knife from his old bookbinding tools and carefully worked it into the seam of the cover. The leather was old, but it gave way with a soft crackle. Inside, a section of the thick cardboard backing had been hollowed out, and nestled within the custom-cut compartment was a much smaller, slim journal, bound in simple, unadorned black calfskin. It was not a corporate artifact. It was personal. It was a secret. lost to time that had been delivered to his front door. For the next several weeks, Elias lived a double life. By day, he continued the official translation, emailing the files to OmniGen's archive department. But by night, he turned to the Black Journal. The text inside was written in the same dialect, but it was a different language entirely. It was a coded shorthand, a complex cipher of altered letters, symbols, and seemingly random numerical sequences. His mind, trained to decode meaning, lit up with a feverish energy. The physical toll was immense. Sleepless nights blurred into gray, coffee-fueled days. He grew thin, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He hit dead ends, filled pages of notebooks with failed hypotheses, and stared at the coded script until the symbols danced before his eyes. He was obsessed, driven by a force he didn't yet understand. He was no longer just a translator. He was an archaeologist, digging for a truth he felt, with every fiber of his being, was buried just beneath the surface. One evening, Leo padded out of his room, rubbing his eyes. He saw the pages of strange symbols spread across his father's desk. Elias was hunched over them, his face a mask of frustrated concentration. "Are you trying to read the dragon language, Papa?" Leo asked, pointing a small finger at one of the pages. Elias looked up, startled. "Something like that, buddy?" "That one," Leo said, pointing to a recurring symbol, a small circle with a jagged line through it. "It looks like the shattered star of Oak Haven. From my book, it's a bad sign. It means a promise was broken." Elias stared at the symbol. A promise was broken. It wasn't a letter. It was an idea. A jolt went through him. He had been trying to decipher a code, but what if it was a cipher of concepts? He grabbed Leo's fantasy book, his heart hammering in his chest. He cross-referenced the symbol with the journal. It was a key, the one he had been missing. Leo, with his innocent, imaginative insight, had given him the Rosetta Stone. With the conceptual key, the journal's secrets began to unfurl. The translation was no longer academic. It was horrifying. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones as he uncovered the confessions of Alistair Finch. It was a litany of sins that formed the true foundation of OmniGen. He read of how Finch had stolen the core chemical formula for his first breakthrough drug from a university colleague, a brilliant chemist who died in a convenient lab fire just months later. He read a detailed account of the industrial sabotage of a rival's factory, an act that bankrupted the company and left several workers maimed. Then he came to the entries about the Ashworth mine. The journal described in cold, precise detail how Finch, as the secret owner of a mining subsidiary, had systematically cut costs on safety measures, timber supports, ventilation systems, gas detectors. He detailed the warnings from the foreman, all ignored. Then came the entry for October 12, 1958. A tunnel collapse, dozens of men buried alive. The journal then became a manual for a cover-up. The bribing of local officials, the paltry, insulting sums paid to the grieving families in exchange for their silence, the carefully crafted press narrative of a natural disaster. Finch had built his empire on a mass grave. clicked into place. He found a faded photograph tucked into the back of the journal, one he'd overlooked. It was the same girl, Eleanor, a few years younger. On the back, an inscription, "To my dearest child, may she give rise to a legacy greater than mine." Marcus Thorne was not just the CEO of OmniGen. He was the grandson of a criminal, the inheritor of a blood-soaked legacy. The discovery changed everything. Elias's strategy shifted. This was no longer about begging for a cure. He began researching Marcus Thorne himself, reading every interview, watching every public appearance. He built a psychological profile of a man obsessed with control, with legacy, with the myth of being a self-made man. Elias Vance, the quiet translator, was no longer preparing a plea. He was a scholar, a historian, and a prosecutor, meticulously building an irrefutable case. He was preparing to present Marcus Thorne with the one thing his power and money could not defeat, the truth. The knowledge of Alistair Finch's crime settled not as a weapon in Elias's hands, but as a profound weight upon his soul. The ghosts of Ashworth Mine were no longer abstract figures in a 50-year-old journal. They were men with names, with families, with futures that had been stolen and buried under a mountain of greed. He owed them a debt. This conviction drove him back to his research. But this time he wasn't looking for Finch or Thorne. He was looking for the victims. He spent another week tracing the faint, fading lines of their existence, discovering a legacy of cascading poverty, of opportunities denied, of lives permanently stunted by a tragedy that one man's wealth had systematically erased from history. The paltry sums they had received were not compensation. They were an insult that had festered for generations. This grim discovery solidified his resolve, transforming it from a father's desperate hope into a scholar's pursuit of justice. His goal was no longer just to save Leo. It was to force a reckoning. He acted with the precision of a man preparing his life's work for publication. He compiled everything into a meticulous digital dossier, a complete, notarized translation of the journal, high-resolution scans of the original coded pages, his exhaustive research on the Ashworth victims, and the irrefutable genealogical records linking Marcus Thorne directly to Alistair Finch. He created 2 encrypted copies of this file. The first he sent on a small thumb drive to a trusted former university colleague in Germany, a man of unimpeachable integrity, with a simple, chilling instruction. If you do not hear from me by the 1st of next month, release this to the international press. The second copy he secured in a cloud-based vault protected by a password known only to him and his late wife. It was a dead man's switch, a final, silent checkmate. His quiet life had taught him to be careful. His recent education in the sins of the powerful had taught him to be ruthless. Finally, he was ready. He opened a new encrypted email client, the digital equivalent of a sterile, soundproof room. The recipient was Marcus Thorne's private, unlisted address, a small but crucial detail he had uncovered in his research. The subject line he chose was not a name, but a number, a piece of data that would be meaningless to anyone but its intended target. Ashworth Mine Operating License, R734B. The body of the email was even more Spartan. It contained only a single translated sentence from Alistair Finch's journal, a whisper from the grave delivered by modern technology. The dust from Ashworth still settles on my soul, even if the world has forgotten the names of the men beneath it. He hit send. It was not a plea, it was a summons. Thorne's reply came in under an hour. It was a single word. Where? Elias chose the location with symbolic care. A quiet, oak-paneled reading room in the city's old public library. a neutral ground of silent knowledge and shared history. He arrived first, choosing a large table in the center, the scent of old paper and leather polish filling the air. He sat not as a supplicant, but as a scholar about to present his findings. Thorne did not come alone. He swept into the room flanked by a man whose sharp suit and expensive leather briefcase screamed, "Lawyer!" Thorne's face was a mask of controlled fury, his eyes burning with a cold fire as he sat opposite Elias. "This is a mistake," Thorne began, his voice a low growl that was absorbed by the book-lined walls. "Whatever pathetic little game you think you're playing, it ends now. You have stolen private property. You are attempting to extort me. My lawyers will bury you so deep you'll forget your own name." Elias remained calm, his posture unchanged. He simply slid a single laminated page across the polished oak table. It was a copy of the journal entry detailing the Ashworth cover-up, the ink stark against the white page. The lawyer glanced at it and scoffed, a practiced look of dismissal on his face. "An old, unverified document. Inadmissible. For all we know, you forged it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me explain your legal position, Mr. Vance. You are facing decades in prison." For the first time, Elias met the lawyer's gaze directly, his own expression unreadable. "And let me explain my position," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty that cut through the lawyer's bluster. "That document is one of 100 pages. The complete translation, along with corroborating evidence, is currently in the hands of a third party outside this country, with instructions to release it to the press should I fail to contact them by a specific date." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silence before turning his attention fully to Thorne. "Furthermore, I imagine your corporate board, already sensitive after the recent pharmaceutical scandals, would be deeply interested in the true origin story of the Omnigen brand. A public fight, even one you might eventually win in court, would trigger investigations that could unravel everything." The lawyer's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine alarm. Thorne's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. The threat of prison was one thing. The threat of public annihilation, of his entire legacy being exposed as a fraud, was another. The power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. "What do you want?" Thorne finally asked, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Restitution," Elias said simply. He slid a second folder across the table. It did not contain a monetary demand. "I am not here for blackmail," he continued, his voice even. "I am here to offer you a path to correct the historical record, a path to redemption." Thorne opened the folder. Inside was not a ransom note, but a structured multi-point proposal. He read of the immediate admission of Leo Vance into the Genesis trial, with all medical expenses covered by a private trust. He read of the creation and permanent endowment of a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation, to be named the Ashworth Memorial Fund, dedicated to supporting families affected by industrial accidents. Finally, he read the draft of a public statement, one that would revise the company's official history, to acknowledge that its founding success was built upon the contributions of key partners and laborers, whose immense sacrifices had been previously overlooked. He stared at the pages, his mind, the mind of a ruthless strategist, processing the proposal's elegant, brutal efficiency. It was airtight. It gave him an out. It allowed him to become a philanthropist, a corporate statesman correcting the errors of a bygone era, all while preserving the empire his grandfather had built on a foundation of lies. He looked up at Elias, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a pathetic beggar, but as an intellectual equal, an opponent who had utterly outmaneuvered him not with force, but with intellect. A grudging, bitter respect began to dawn in his eyes. "You have given this a lot of thought," Thorn said, his voice devoid of its earlier venom. "I was hired to translate your family's history," Elias replied, a hint of steel in his tone. "I simply ensured my translation was complete." Thorn closed the folder and pushed it toward his lawyer. "Do it," he commanded. He stood, looked at Elias one last time, and offered a single curt nod. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement of defeat. He turned and walked out of the library, leaving Elias alone at the table, the weight of 100 ghosts finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. 6 months later, the air in the park was crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. Leo, his face fuller, his cheeks rosy with health, chased a soccer ball with a pack of other children. His laughter was clear and strong, a sound unburdened by the rasp and wheeze that had haunted his childhood for so long. He moved freely, his lungs no longer a cage, but the engine of his joy. Elias sat on a nearby bench, watching his son, a quiet sense of wonder still fresh in his heart. He pulled out his phone and opened a news app, his thumb scrolling to a bookmarked article. The headline was from a small local station in West Virginia. "Ashworth Memorial Fund awards first grant, saves family from medical bankruptcy." The article told the story of a coal miner's family, facing ruin after a debilitating injury had left the father unable to work. The grant from Thorn's new foundation, the article explained, had covered all their debts and secured their future. He read the words, a quiet satisfaction settling deep within him. He had not sought vengeance, but justice, and its ripples were spreading further than he could have ever imagined. He looked up from the screen, his gaze finding his son. Leo had just scored a goal and was running toward him, his arms outstretched, his smile as bright and brilliant as the afternoon sun. Elias met him with a hug, lifting him off the ground and spinning him around. In that moment, holding his healthy, laughing son, he understood. The quiet persistence of hope, armed with an ancient, unspoken truth, had not only won a future, it had paid a debt, and in doing so, had rewritten more than one story.
Thank you for taking a quiet moment with us. Every story is a journey, and we're so glad you joined us for this one.
We believe stories are a way to connect, even when we're apart. If you felt a connection to this tale, we invite you to subscribe and become part of our growing circle.
Our question for you today is, what's a simple moment of peace you've experienced this week?
Share it in the comments. Let's fill this space with serene moments.
Until the next story, be well.